Hello, this video is designed to discuss proper writing technique for writing formal laboratory reports. And in particular, this video is made to accompany the writing designation of a laboratory course in the sciences. So, as we can see here, we have the writing designated course syllabus appendix. And so the top bit here just basically talks about the statement of the mission of the writing designated program. So basically, the idea is that these principles that are laid out in this writing designated syllabus appendix, these principles can be applied to writing in any field that you choose to endeavor. So whether you are dealing with creative writing, if you're writing fiction or nonfiction or writing laboratory reports, you can follow these steps in order to make yourself a more effective writer. And so the idea of having writing designated courses in different fields is that you can see how these same principles can be applied to make yourself a much more effective formal report writer. Okay, so the writing designation here at St. Vincent College, to have a writing designated course, they want us to espouse the idea of this sixth principle of good writing. And so every writing designated course uses these six principles developed by St. Vincent faculty in its own discipline specific and assignment specific way. So I'm going to go through these individual six principles and relate them to writing a high quality formal laboratory report. And then we'll go through the three stages of good writing practice and again relate that to the writing of a formal report. Okay, first off, our six principles of good writing. The first principle, number one, purpose. For example, the thesis and direction are clear. The writing is addressed to a well-defined audience. So when we're writing a formal laboratory report, we first need to consider who our audience should be. And so when you're writing a report, you should assume that the person reading the report is familiar with science, but not an expert in the field. So therefore, since they're familiar with science, you don't have to define all the chemicals that you're using. You don't have to define what your glassware as a specific instrument is. For example, the reader is going to know what a graduated cylinder is. The reader is going to know what a burette is. The reader is going to be familiar with copper sulfate or a different referring to sugar as glucose. Okay, so you're going to be dealing with a person that knows science, but you are unfamiliar with what you're specifically working with. So you need to write everything out with enough detail that a person in the sciences can understand completely what you're dealing with. So it should be clear and direct, but you should assume a baseline scientific understanding. Next, organization. For example, ideas and support are developed one at a time, systematically and logically. So the way that we organize our laboratory reports, having an introduction, then having a method section, a result section, a discussion, and a conclusion. Or for general chemistry, we organize it as the background information, our beginning question and justification, our method section, our claims and evidence, and the reading and reflection section. So both of those that I just mentioned kind of mimic each other, whether you're talking about a general chemistry laboratory report or if you're talking about an actual scientific manuscript. So those different sections that we have here are laid out with a very well-defined organization. So the scientific report itself, just inherent by its layout, is highly organized. But this organization factor here also applies to within a section. So if you're talking about a method section, you should lay out the methods or the procedure in paragraph form in a highly organized and sequential fashion. You shouldn't jump around for the reader of all these different things that you did. You should present them in a logical fashion so they can find a linear direction of what you actually did in the project. Next would be the results section. Within the results section, so you want to think about writing a formal report as telling a story. you have one directional line going from the introduction all the way to the conclusion. And everything that you write within that formal report should follow along that line to get you to your final conclusion. Anything that's a deviation off of that line is a separate report that you should write. Okay, so everything leads to that final end conclusion that you want to your reader to leave with. So when you're writing your results section, you want to have it in a highly organized fashion that follows the procedure that you laid out. You want to restate sort of what you did in your restate your procedure in a few sentences at the beginning of your results section, because you need to remind your reader what you did. Because in a real life situation, a lot of times the reader is actually going to skip over the method section and just jump straight to the results and discussion. So you want to start off your results section by sort of restating what you did in your study, and then you're going to present the results one at a time in a highly organized and sequential fashion. So you're going to include your data typically in graphical form, and then you're going to write very clearly and describe what's happening in each of these graphs. So in that results section, there should not be any opinion or further analysis of the data. You're strictly just explaining what's happened in a highly organized and sequential fashion. And then in the discussion section or the reading and reflection section, again, you're going to remind the reader what you did. So kind of an overview of the procedure, and then you're going to more critically describe what you did or what the results actually mean. And so what are the implications of those results, and then how they relate to work that's previously been done. And so when you're writing a high quality report, that organization should mimic each other in all three of those sections. So the procedure should follow in the same order as the results, should follow in the same order as the reading and reflection or the discussion section. Okay, if you jump around and do different order in all three sections, that will make the reader confused. So you need to make sure that you're highly organized and consistent. Next, number 3, coherence. For example, conceptual links are provided between individual elements of the writing. Okay, so the same sort of idea that since we have highly organized methods, results, and discussion sections, all of those sections are going to be linked to each other. And so you're going to follow that same order. It should be a highly linked document. But what really jumps out at me for a formal report for coherence is the introduction section should actually mimic the reading and reflection or the discussion section. So any sort of topic that you're going to be bringing in and discussing in a more critical fashion in the reading and reflection or discussion section needs to be introduced in the introduction section. So the introduction or your background should cover any key component. So if you're doing a blue bottle lab where you are talking about the reaction of methylene blue with vitamin C, sodium chloride, and copper sulfate, it might be a good idea in the introduction to sort of give a background about all of those different chemicals, what they are typically used for, and in the introduction section, so the reader has an idea of what's going on. And you can also sort of describe the baseline reaction as it occurs. So you should introduce concepts that the reader is going to hearken back to in the discussion. You should introduce those concepts in the introduction, and then so that way when they are seeing them later on in the report, it's not the first time that they're seeing them. Okay, so coherence just means all of these sections should be linked together. Okay, number 4, support. For example, all claims, ideas, generalizations, and conclusions are justified by logically presented evidence. So again, the organization of the formal laboratory report has this support built in. So having a separate results and discussion section, or a claims and evidence, or results in the claims and evidence and reading and reflection section, we have built in here the claims are your conclusions and the evidence is the support. Okay, so whether you are separating out claims and evidence in your discussion section, or if you have them sort of combined together, it's important that every single claim that you make, that you support with underlying evidence. Okay? And the evidence that you provide should not just be, um, you make a claim and say, look at figure 2. Okay, so in that case, you are assuming that the reader is going to look at figure 2 and interpret it the way that you want. You should assume that the reader is unable to draw the connections and make the interpretation that you believe is true. You need to physically walk the reader through your thought process that led you to the conclusions that you draw. So the support you need to actually write in paragraph form and really spell out every bit of detail about that support for any claims that you make. Number 5, clarity. For example, diction and syntax are precise. The writer has considered the reader's understanding. So just as I said there, you should assume that you need to walk the reader through absolutely every detail. Okay, so you don't want to leave any stone unturned. So if you do not explicitly lay out all of your discussion to your reader, there's a possibility that your reader will be confused and leave with a different end message than you desire for them. So it's important for you to be incredibly clear and write out with clear detail all of the different points that you'd like to make for the reader. Okay, and so you want to basically hold your reader's hand through the entire report so that it's very clear. Number 6, insight. For example, the writer has found creative ways to integrate, synthesize, and interpret challenging ideas. Okay, so what this sort of means is you want your report to be compelling. Okay, so in the end of the day, they're humans that are reading this laboratory report, whether you're turning it in to me to read for a grade, or if further down the road you're working for a company and you have to write up a report for your boss or for shareholders to read, you want the document that you write up to be interesting and compelling. You want the reader to want to keep reading. Okay, so that means that when you write the report, it shouldn't be dry. It should have some interest to it. So a good way to build interest is when you're writing your introduction section or your background section to start, you should build a case for why the reader should care or why the reader should want to continue to listen. Okay, so for example, you can start off with a more broad question of something that is of universal interest. Okay, and then you can introduce some of the key concepts, and then you want to end with a question. Okay, and so this, you should have built a case in your introduction that piques the reader's attention. And then the question that you ask at the end is highly interesting, and it makes the reader want to turn the page and see how you ended up answering that question. Okay, so a high quality introduction can be really key in order for the to grab the reader's attention and to make them want to keep reading. And then, so as the report moves on, you're sort of unfolding the answer to that question that you asked at the beginning of the introduction. And so that allows the reading to be creative and allows it to provide high quality insight and to actually get the reader to the end of the document. All right, so that's the 6 principles of good writing: purpose, organization, coherence, support, clarity, and insight. So you should consider those 6 principles when writing any document. So next, let's focus on the 3 stages of good writing practice. So every writing designated course prioritizes writing practice that includes planning, drafting, and revising. And each writing designated course employs an approach appropriate for that specific course. So whether you're dealing for a report that you're writing for my writing designated course, or if you're just writing a document in general, you should follow these 3 stages. And if you do that, you're going to see that your writing is drastically improved. And so I didn't realize it until I was reviewing this material to record this video. But this is actually the exact stages that I was taught in graduate school to write high quality manuscripts, and that I still use today when I'm writing professionally. So this is not just an anecdote, this is actually something that is highly useful and used by professionals in the field. Okay, the first stage is planning. So we want to plan, so to define the purpose, gather support, and organize an argument. So first off, we're going to conceive a topic. So we need to first understand the assignment. So read the assignment carefully to determine its specific requirements. If necessary, seek clarification from the instructor. Okay, so if you are so whether we're dealing with a course where we have a well-defined goal laid out by an instructor, or if you are in a company where your boss asks you to write a report for a specific audience, whoever's in charge will have, or whether you're the boss, you're in charge, whoever's in charge of drafting this document should have an idea of what the end message that they would like to convey with the document. And so it's important that we understand what the goal of the writing is. Okay, so we're not just writing for our own health. Typically, if we're writing formal reports, we're writing for a purpose. We want to either convince somebody to give us money, or we want to convince somebody to give us a good grade, or we're wanting to convince somebody to give us something. Okay, so we need to understand what is the goal of the document. We need to understand the assignment completely. So once we are in complete understanding of what the goal of the topic is, we can move on to brainstorming on the subject. So we need to make lists, take notes, and use other brainstorming techniques to make connections and associations within the broad material. So you should not just open up a document and say, I'm going to write my lab report now, and just start typing. You first need to sit and think about what it is that you want to say. If you just start writing without an idea of what you want to say, you're going to end up with an unstructured and a kind of a lackluster effort. You first need to sit down and brainstorm. You need to understand, what's the goal of this document? What do I want the reader to leave understanding at the end? Okay, so to physically take notes, write things down, talk to other people, brainstorm, and figure out what it is that you would like the reader to leave with. Next, limit the focus. So use the connections that you made when brainstorming to limit the subject to a manageable paper topic that is relevant to you and the assignment, or to the reader. Okay, so this is a sort of a challenging thing for amateur writers to sort of get a hold of. So especially, I'll take you back to graduate school. So when I was in graduate school, so you're in the laboratory, you're collecting tons and tons and tons of data. Okay, you need to, obviously, when you're writing a manuscript or a formal report that you're going to send out for publication, you can't include all the data that you've collected because you have mounds and mounds of data. You need to select a specific subset of those data that tell a compelling story that you're going to present for review. Okay, if you included all of the data, we call that data dumping. If you data dump all of your data, what you're going to have is sort of a hodgepodge, and it's not a very focused effort. So you need to limit your focus. The same sort of thing happens when you're working in the laboratory in a general chemistry class or in any other course here at St. Vincent. When you are not all of the data that you are collecting in the laboratory is actually going to go into your final report. You need to focus it down and synthesize all of the data and determine what's interesting and what is needed in order to drive home your final point that you came up with in your brainstorming session. Okay, so you need to limit down and highly focus the information that you're presenting in order to tell a compelling story. You should not be including data into a report just for the fact of including it because you did it. That is a waste of everyone's time. You only want to incorporate data that is useful towards driving home your final goal. So limit the focus and limit the data. Next, determine your purpose. So consider the audience. Consider your purpose in terms of a clear, defined audience. So this we sort of defined earlier. Every document has a specific purpose. You need to have that goal in mind when you are brainstorming for the project. And you want to keep that purpose in mind the entire time when you are writing your document. Next, take a stand and define your purpose. To take a clear stance, be sure that it is an arguable assertion. Make it account for quote because and quote so what. Consider if it is possible to make an opposing stance and try to argue against it. Okay, so when we are considering our purpose, okay, we have brainstormed about we have collected all the data, we've looked at the data, we have brainstormed on the subject, and we have decided that this narrow focus is going to be the take-home message that we want our reader to go home with. Now we need to figure out what is the best combination of evidence that I have to support that final finding. And then when you have developed all of that evidence and you have it laid in front of you, now you want to try to poke holes in it. Okay? Take a look at your data, find any weaknesses in your data. And then so make sure in your reading and reflection or your discussion section that you are identifying those areas of weakness and you are explaining them to the reader. So you don't want the reader to walk away from your document stating, yeah, they made that statement, but I have this, and this question that make me question everything that the writer had to say. Okay? You don't want the reader leaving with that feeling. You want the reader to leave seeing that you have defended your entire statement and that you have a well thought out conclusion. Okay? So make sure that you are thinking through really considering what your final message is, and you're not just haphazardly throwing out a conclusion. The next step after you have defined your purpose and you've identified the data that you're going to use and you have thought about it from every angle should be to gather support in research. So this is the reading part of our reading and reflection section and a key aspect to the formal report discussion section. And so you need to go then to the outside literature. So go to Google Scholar, and search for other professional articles that have done similar sort of studies. And you should be able to find some sort of theoretical support for the assertions that you are making. Okay, so if you go and make a statement that you think is well supported, if you don't have any outside evidence to provide credence to your claim, then your claim does not carry very much weight. Okay, so you need to go outside and actually gather that research support. So after you have completely conceptualized and thought out your study, you're going to then make an outline. So an outline, you're going to follow the main points of your thesis. So for the outline, I recommend laying out all the different sections of your laboratory report, your introduction, your method section, your results section, discussion, and conclusions. And so you're going to lay out all those sections, and then you're going to make bullet points underneath of all of the key aspects that you want to introduce. And so you want to make sure that you have your coherence between your sections so that your methods section, your results section, discussion follow a similar sort of order, and that your introduction and discussion sections contain similar sort of concepts. Okay, so you're going to, and not in paragraph form, this is going to be a bullet point outline. Make sure that follows the main points of your thesis. You want to balance the sections of your paper to ensure that you have sufficient supporting points and illustrations for each argumentative point. So anything that you're going to bring up in your discussion needs to show up in your introduction. And anything that you are discussing in your method section, you need to have data to support that in the results section. And any data you provide in the results section needs to show up in the discussion section. Okay? You should not discuss an experiment in the method section that you then don't provide data for later on. And you shouldn't provide any data in the results section that you do not subsequently talk about in the discussion section. Okay, so all the sections should be linked to each other, and working through an outline is a good way to make sure that everything is having proper coherence and proper organization. Next, note and revise any weaknesses in your thesis. Okay, so your thesis is basically, that's going to be your question or your statement that you want the reader to go home with an understanding of. Okay, your final take home message. So you need to make sure that you have a completely well defined question that you're asking at the beginning and that you have a well defined answer that is supported with sufficient evidence and external reading support at the end. All right, that takes us now to number 2. So once we have uh, our well thought out thesis idea and we have an outline that's written out, now we're able to put our fingers down to the keyboard and start to write out the paragraphs that will become our original draft. So the draft is where we realize the organization in coherent, balanced paragraphs. So we follow our outline as a guideline for organization. So now we're just basically looking at that outline point by point, and we are writing that down in paragraph form with appropriate transitions between ideas, and so that it turns into an interesting, well thought out document. Okay, so you're going to focus here on coherence. So you want to make sure that you introduce transitions to make ideas flow smoothly and logically. Okay, so you need to make sure that in your introduction, if you start off with a broader sort of perspective, then you're going to narrow it down to more specific ideas, and then focus it all the way down to your specific question that you'd like to ask. You want to make sure that each of the different points that you bring up are going to be tied together. Okay, you don't want to have any rough transitions from topic to topic. You want one topic to lead from one into the other. Okay, and so an example that this was just on my brain because this is a manuscript that I wrote just recently. So the research that I do is developing novel sensors for measuring neurochemicals in the brain. Okay, so my introduction section, I started off by talking about why dopamine is so important in the brain and how dysfunction in dopamine is prevalent in neurological disorders. So it's highly important that we measure dopamine in the brain. So that's a very broad, sort of wide-reaching attention grabber. Okay, and then so the next paragraph, I transition straight saying, these are some techniques that have been used for measuring dopamine in the brain previously. Okay, so there's a direct coherence, a direct link between that introduction attention grabber, and now this is what the state-of-the-art material uses. And so within that paragraph, I introduce electrochemistry using electrodes to measure dopamine, which is the sort of research I do. So I've narrowed down that focus a little bit. Now, the next paragraph, I focus on specific method of electrochemical detection. So fast scan cyclophotometry has been used at carbon fiber microelectrodes for measuring dopamine. Okay, so I've narrowed it even more. So now I'm talking about an electrode coating that I put on the electrode. So I put a conductive polymer called graphene oxide on that electrode tip. So I now introduced graphene oxide. And then I finish with a question. I wonder if does incorporation of graphene oxide onto carbon fiber microelectrodes improve the detection of dopamine in the brain using fast scan cyclophotometry? So that at the end is my beginning question that I have supported with all of my introduction. Okay, so hopefully, even though that analogy is way above all of your head, hopefully you can see how I started with a macro, interesting attention grabber, and I've narrowed it down in a very logical, cohesive fashion to tell a story that introduces an interesting question that I'll then present data for in the upcoming sections of the manuscript. Okay, so in there we've introduced transitions to make the idea flow smoothly and logically. Next, provide sufficient support for each point. Ensure that the argument is well balanced as a whole. So if you've outlined properly previously, you should have all of that sufficient support laid out in a clear and organized fashion. So you shouldn't actually be reinventing the wheel at all when you're drafting your document. All of the hard work was actually done in the outline. All you're doing here is just making sure that the English in the paragraph actually sounds compelling. All right, and then you want to work quickly. Defer editing and proofreading until later. So you have this outline now, and so now it's all about getting that idea down on your paper. Okay, getting a draft that's written and out there, get you the confidence of pounding out 8 pages of a document or so, however long it's going to be. So you're actually just filling up that white space with your document. And so it kind of gives you an excitement dopamine rush there that you're actually completing your document and you're making something that's a compelling, interesting story. Okay, so you can go back and do your editing and proofreading later. Make sure to just get those ideas out on the page. All right, so that's the initial draft. Step 3, revise. So once you have that completed draft, the introduction, your method section, your results section, your discussion, all of that's down on the paper. Now it's time to rethink the document and refine it to make it into a high quality final product. So we need to rethink, refine, edit, and proofread. So the first step is to seek feedback on your draft. So obviously you don't want to send an unedited draft to a friend or to a professor to read. You know, if you have typos and grammatical errors and transition problems everywhere, then the person is not going to be very happy to read that document. So you first need to go through and do some edits on your own. But once you're feeling pretty confident with the draft, send it off to somebody else to read. And so allow your peer or professor to read that document and have them provide some feedback in terms of the 6 principles of good writing that I laid out earlier. So you want to ask your reader to look for the larger issues in the paper rather than merely proofreading it. So you want to get feedback on that initial draft. Is the reader able to logically understand what your take-home message should be in the document? Okay? Is the reader able to leave with the specific understanding that you want them to leave with? Okay? Are you completing the actual task of writing a successful report? Okay? So you can get to the proofreading stuff later. Is the actual message coming through clearly? Okay? If the message is not coming through clearly, if the reader is unable to follow your method section, or the reader is unable to understand your results, or your reader is unable to tell you the conclusion, then you need to go back and substantially edit and fix the way that you're telling your story. Okay? And then so they're going to give you back that initial feedback on the draft. So next you're going to think about beginning globally. Ensure that the purpose is realized. Okay, so you're going to get feedback from your peer review. Is the reader actually leaving with the intended conclusion that you want them to? Check for sound organization. Is the report laid out in the way that's supposed to? Does everything follow a logical order? Is that logical order mimicked in the methods, results, and discussion section? Is everything organized properly? Determine that support is adequate. So does your reader have enough evidence for all of the different claims that you're making? Are they able to poke any holes in the claims? And ensure that the document incorporates new insights. Are you actually providing some sort of interesting conclusion at the end? Or are you just writing this to get a grade? Okay, so hopefully we're teaching you to be a scientist. We're teaching you not to just write to get a grade. We're teaching you to write to convey a compelling story. Okay, so you want that report not to read like you're just doing it for a grade. You want the report to read like it's something that you care about. Okay, so I would provide these 4 sort of global ideas to your peer to think of as they are reviewing your document. Okay, and then once you finish with that global revision, then you want to continue to locally. So edit for coherence. Make sure that you have that similar order between your methods, results, and discussion section, and make sure that you have coherence between your introduction and your discussion. So you may have added a few things to your discussion as a result of the feedback from your peer review. If you've added something to your discussion, make sure that that is also reflected in your introduction as well. And then edit for clarity. You want to make sure that your final document has the same sort of voice the entire time, and that your document is grammatically correct, does not have typos, has nice transitions, and that it reads smoothly. Okay, just a quick note on in terms of the voice in which you should write a scientific article. So you should so there's sort of debate whether you write in third person or first person when you're writing, or passive voice versus active voice. When you're writing a scientific article, you should always write in the active voice, and you should also write in terms of the chemicals as the main focus of the document. Okay, you don't have to pretend like you as the technician don't exist, but the focus should not be on you. The focus should be on the chemicals themselves. So if we're thinking about the Blue Bottle Lab back in Gen Chem 1, instead, a good focus being on the chemicals would state that methylene blue, a solution of methylene blue converts from blue to clear upon the addition of copper sulfate, vitamin C, and sodium chloride. Okay, so the main focus, then the noun, the main focus, what we're talking about in that sentence is on the chemicals. Talking about the methylene blue solution is affected by, changes colors by copper sulfate, vitamin C, and sodium chloride. A bad example of writing using the first person in terms of the technician would be, when my solution of methylene blue turned from blue to clear after I added vitamin C, copper sulfate, and sodium chloride. It doesn't matter that you did it. It didn't matter that anybody did it. It matters what the chemicals do. The focus should be on what are the physical properties and the chemical properties of these specific chemicals, not what did you do as a technician. What you do doesn't matter. It matters what the chemicals do. That should be the focus of the document. So you should write the document in active voice with the focus being on the specific chemicals, not on you as a technician. Okay, so the final bit to this document is a final proofread. So after you have received your peer feedback and that you've revised globally and locally, you want to take multiple passes through the document to assure grammar, mechanics, typos, formatting are all completely finished and looking good. And then it's a good idea to give it back for a second peer review, for somebody to read through again, just for grammatical purposes, to make sure that everything looks good. Okay, and then after you're totally finished, you'll want to export your final document into a .pdf file so that any of your figures or graphs are going to keep their design formatting that you'd like for them, and that you are then ready to submit to wherever your report is going to go. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your time.